Willie D Live.
I think the problem, and this is why I felt like I wasn't as close with my family, my parents, as much as I wish I was, is that there was just such a huge cultural divide between us. They were Russians coming from Russia. My dad was, I think, 11 years older than my mom. So he was like, I believe, like in his late 30s maybe coming over. She was like in her late 20s. Imagine being in your 20s or 30s and suddenly being thrown into a whole other country with a whole different language, a whole different culture. Like if we put you in China right now, you'd probably go and try to find some Americans and try to hold on to your own culture as opposed to really engulfing yourself into Chinese culture. And that's ultimately what happened. I grew up as a child, as a 5-year-old. Although Russian was my first language, I learned English very quickly. I didn't have an accent. Like when you hear me talk, can you hear an accent?
No.
Yeah, see, I never really have an accent. My dad had a very thick accent. My mom had an accent as well. And they really just associated with other Russians. My mom had Russian friends. My dad didn't really have a lot of friends.
Did y'all live in a Russian community?
No. And that was sort of the thing of like, in San Francisco, when we first moved, for like maybe, 6 months, there was a big Russian community around and so forth, especially, when I was at school, there was lots of other Russian kids. But where we settled, where my parents bought a home, which was in San Mateo, California, I was like the only Russian kid anywhere. In fact, like in the school, I only had one other friend who was Russian. He was half black, half Russian. He had a black dad and a Russian mom.
Military kid?
No, his mom cheated on his dad at work.
Okay.
and told him that, lied about who his real dad was and said, oh, you must have had a black relative somewhere in your family we didn't know about. So he grew up thinking he was white when he was really black. And, it was a whole clusterfuck that he had to, deal with in therapy later on in life.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just me and him. And it was a lot of fights, man. You got to think that during that time in the 80s, Russia and America were essentially at war. Like that there was a real underlying fear of a nuclear war during that time. You remember those times.
Mm-hmm.
There was like TV shows like The Day After that showed what would happen if there was a nuclear war. Before that there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it was like there was actual nuclear missiles right off the coast of Florida. Like there was times where it was very tense. So I was viewed as very much as an enemy by a lot of kids just because I was named Vlad and I was Russian. And I just remember getting into a lot of fights during that time, having to punch people in the face for saying fucked up shit and, that type of thing just because. And I was the only one.
Did it ever cause you to spiral into depression?
No, because I think right around that time is when I discovered hip-hop. And I kind of fell in love with it early on. And I started to kind of gravitate towards like the black kids and the Filipino kids and the Spanish kids. They were all kind of going through a version of what I was going through themselves. And I think that's what kind of attracted me to the culture and the art form and so forth. And because we were all kind of going through versions of that. I'm not going to say I know what it's like to be black. I don't. You know what I'm saying? But I do know what it's like to be Russian during the Cold War named Vlad. I do know that. And, it's I think there was a certain bond that kind of happened between us because we were all going through this racist type, bigoted type shit, in an area where it was predominantly white and Asian.
Yeah. You've had a lot of controversial figures on your show.
Yeah.
How much of what we see on VladTV is the real deal, and how much of it is, more so for clicks?
I think it's mostly the real deal. I mean, yeah, I play certain things up, for the audience, but I think that when you look at the various figures that have large followings on the internet, it's because that's really who they are. They're being themselves. It's hard to find someone who has millions of followers that's like playing a role. I mean, would you agree with me?
To an extent, I do agree with you. But it is some suckers out there that's misleading people,
Yeah.
and they got a lot of followers.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like you putting people on, you've put a lot of people on. Is there anybody out there that you wish you hadn't put on? Wish you hadn't gave them that big ass platform to amplify their message?
I mean, some things that Charleston White has done after our interviews have been pretty repulsive. You know, talking about raping babies and that type of thing, wishing people's kids would die and mothers and fathers would die and so forth. And that's an example of someone who takes free speech to the worst possible place that you could take it to. And I've done 2 interviews with him. And I remember after the first interview, he had said some stuff about Asians that was kind of repulsive. And me and him had a conversation about that. And it seemed like he kind of understood where I was coming from and seemed like he was not going to keep going in that direction. So we did another interview. But then after that interview, he kind of went even harder into that type of, if you want to call it hate speech or whatever else. So yeah, I'm not too thrilled over having Charleston White on the show. There was a guy that we had on, I don't remember his name, but because sometimes other people do interviews on VladTV. So Sean Perez does a lot of interviews for me. He's a former Bad Boy executive. And he had brought this guy to me that had done other interviews, and he essentially co-signed this guy and was like, listen, this guy was in the car when 50 Cent got shot. He was also the president of Murder Inc. at one point. And, this is Sean telling me, so I'm like, okay, like this is a serious guy. I've never had a reason to doubt anything that he says before. Me and his relationship go back since my mixtape days. So I've known him since like 2004, right? Like over 20 years. So we brought this guy on, and he did the interview with this guy, and he's talking about the 50 Cent situation, he's talking about the Murder Inc. situation. And I remember 50 had posted on his Instagram, it was a screenshot of my interview with this guy talking about how he was in the car when 50 got shot, and it said fraudulent across. And I'm like, damn. All right, let me make some phone calls. So I called him Ja Rule. And I said, was this guy ever the president of Murder Inc.? He said, I have no idea who this person is. So I called Chris Gotti. I said, do you know who this is? He said, I've never heard of this guy in my life. So I just felt stupid, and I think like, I took down all the videos right away, and I think Sean told me that like some guys from this guy's neighborhood ended up pressing him over the situation, and essentially what got back to him was that the only truth in this guy's interview was the projects he grew up in. Everything else was completely made up. So occasionally you get these crazy people, and you see that, these days it's more common. You see people like Jaquar Wright and Orlando Brown and something, people like that who go on these platforms and just make up a bunch of crazy shit, and people just run with it and gets a lot of views and so forth. But that's never been something that I've ever wanted to push, a bunch of false narratives. So yeah, I regret that. And this is why I've never had Jaquar Wright on my show. This is why, I had Orlando Brown on, but after I did the interview with him and I got to see who he really was off camera, I'm like, okay, this is a crazy person. This is someone who's not sane. This is not an act. He really is crazy off camera.
What made you think he was really crazy off camera? Because sometimes when you hear Orlando talking, he seems to know exactly what he's talking about, and he sometimes will tell you, see how I just made you do that and made you think this way, but here, look, I'm really over here, and and he break it down very, like, poetically. But it's like he's very articulate the way that he breaks things down. Well, so how sure can you be that he's actually, mentally off?
Well, being crazy doesn't mean you're dumb. There's a lot of smart, crazy people out there. In fact, genius and insanity sometimes are, it's a very gray line between these two. I just got to hear him talk and have conversations off camera with some of the people that he brought and so forth, and it was just like, okay, he's not really playing this up for the camera. He really does believe some of this stuff, and he really is acting the same way off camera without the cameras rolling than on camera. You know, so I'm like, okay. And it's not like the stuff that he says has ever been validated by anybody.